I feel a spirit, mighty spirit, take me back, bring me back home, where I can be free, where I can be free. Take me back, I wanna go home. The spirit of my ancestors is flying free. Because they live within me. I was wondering, have you all given tribute to your ancestors today? Because all this is about those people who came before. And I was wondering, before I do the next poem, if we might call out to our ancestors to give honor to them. I can start. I give honor to my mother, Rhoda Rollins, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman. Is there anyone?
Dorothy Moore.
Lillian Prairie.
Ashe.
Catherine McRae.
Andrew Hamer. Ashe.
Nina Simone.
Ashe.
Agnes Wolfowitz.
Ashe.
Medgar Evers.
Ashe.
Aretha.
Ashe.
Linus X.
Ashe.
Gordon Hawkins.
Ashe. Ashe.
George Washington Carver.
Ashe.
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Ashe.
John Brown.
Ashe.
Harriet Tubman.
Ashe. So we give honor to all those ancestors who we've spoken and who we have not spoken. I return home, awakening memories I've never known, sorrows I've never experienced. I hear their voices calling me, so sweet and serene. Please help me, they say, but who am I? What can I do? Remember the past, they say, the past you've never lived, the tears you've never cried, the pain you've never suffered, the darkness you've never been blinded by. Open your eyes and see your great-great-great-grandmother giving birth to a powerful nation called America. Take hold. It's your country too. I hear their screams from the dungeons that crowd my sleep, and I awake to pleas for contentment as a snow shower prayers leaves me frozen in the past. Oh God, Mother, Mother, where have you gone? We prepared kinky and fish for you, but you never came home. We searched everywhere for you. Vanished, gone. A place is here for you in the event of your return. I moan a sadness so great for the loss of you. As the stars fill the sky, and behind the sea peeks the last of the sun, I pray its final rays light a path guiding you back home. I awake, lying in the darkness, my eyes filled with tears for missing you. I dreamt of an old woman. I could not see her face, for I was she. I looked down upon my hands, dark and worn, palms and fingers calloused from cotton I picked, she sang. Worn clean through from carrying heavy wicker baskets, overflowing with white woolly gold, born on a stormy morning, still wet with dew from my dripping brow. Springs form deep within and flow red as pawpaw. The earth gladly drinks and asks no questions. This I can remember, she said. I look down at my feet, still trying to recall a nightmare forgotten. I see familiar shoes, worn clean through, from walking roads heavy with stone and shackle, cast by the builders of slave forts on the coast of my home to keep me submissive while they steal me away. 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 Steal me away. Steal me away. Steal me away. I wear my Sunday best, a lace dress the color of death. It covers old bones brittle from misuse and neglect. She is only a dream, say I, but my bones ache as if I had worked the field since the beginning of life oppressed. My hands are hard and crease deep with the heavy burden of remembering. I see ancient villages and menacing slave forts curiously woven together as the sea embraces all. In the marketplace, old women carry baskets heavy with groundnuts, plantain, and tilapia. Eyes red with grief from the burden of knowing. Dark hands worn clean through fill baskets with yams, kenke, and pawpaw. It is she, say I. Now upon my head, I carry a basket overflowing with the memories of an old woman's heartache and toil. I walk the road that leads to the sea, heavy with stone and shackle, my feet worn down from the burden of remembering. Stone turns to pebble, pebble turns to sand, sand turns to dust, dust of an old woman soft and comforting beneath my feet. We face the sea and wait for fishermen to bring nets filled with herring for smoking, memories forgotten, and old bones cast away by the builders of slave ships, overflowing with the blood of my ancestors. Overflowing with the blood of my ancestors. Overflowing with the blood of your ancestors. Mama, Papa, sisters, brothers, it's the morning time, she say. Time to mourn what we've lost. Time to remember what's forgotten. Time to heal what's broke. Time to ride the nightmare and lasso the dream. Bojuba, Bojuba. Mojibra, King Prembe the First, thank you for holding out. Mojuba, Queen Mother Ya Asantewa, thank you for the sacrifice. Mojuba Charles Spalio Sr., thank you for the for perseverance. Mojuba Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, thank you for the written word. Mojuba great-great-grandma Alitha Keturah Gill, thank you for surviving. Ashe. Thank you. That is a poem that I wrote after, poems that I wrote after visiting Ghana for the first time. I don't know, I have my notes here, but they're gone. So I'm just gonna wing it. Yes, I went to Ghana and I went into the slave dungeons. And it was there that it was just put on my heart that, that my family had been there. And unfortunately for me, as much as I have studied and researched, I have not found my way back to Africa as to be able to identify my ancestors. I can't call their name. I don't know the exact place where I come from. Now, I took the spiritual journey, you know, through my poetry and through the place. And so I know for a fact that they were there, but I can't call their name. And so I have to go back to my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, because as Dr. Morris was saying, he was the one who told the stories. You know, he was so proud of our family, the Fowler family. And he talked about my great-great-great-grandfather, who was born in Nova Scotia, because we were from Nova Scotia, and how he was so strong that he was hit in the head by a horse and knocked him down. But great-great-great-grandpa, he got right back up, he was mad. And my grandfather would never swear in front of women, so he would say, "That's so-and-so horse." And so he went and he punched the horse out and knocked that horse over. So you know, somebody strong like that can pretty much overcome anything. And it would be David Fowler's father who came to Nova Scotia. And in my research, after my grandfather passed away in 1988, you know, because I had this fear of that I wouldn't remember the stories, and I don't remember a lot of those stories. I remember that one, but a lot of them I didn't. You know, and you know, when he started, my earliest recollection, I think I was about 5. So I have to give myself a break because maybe I just didn't understand what he was talking about. So David Fowler's father, Reuben, with his brother came to Nova Scotia, and I don't have any records, really, of how they got there, but they were identified as Black Loyalists, and if you don't know who the Black Loyalists were, have you heard of them before, most of you? No, okay, so after the Revolutionary War, when the British lost, there were many free and enslaved people who fought in the Revolutionary War because they were led to believe that they would they would get their freedom. And so, of course, the British lost, and part of the negotiations on their behalf, which was the Treaty of Paris in 1783, 3,500 Black Loyalists, men, women, and children, were transported to Nova Scotia. And so Reuben and Louis, they got there, but they weren't on any of those ships. So they could have walked over, they could have rowed over, I really don't know. And one of the, as part of the agreement, they were supposed to get land and some kind of compensation. And for most Black people, that did not happen. On the other hand, the white loyalists, they were given, 300 acres of land, while the Negro loyalist was given, 1 acre. In some rare occasions, a black loyalist was given 50 acres, but for the most part, and they were given the worst part, soil that was really not workable. So these are some of the things that my ancestors overcame. And so they eventually migrated to Massachusetts. And the living conditions were just terrible. They underestimated. They thought that bringing all these people to Nova Scotia would cause this boon, that they'd have an economic boon, and they did not. There was not enough work. There were riots because they thought, the white loyalists thought black loyalists were getting those, the menial jobs of, being servants and things like that. And so they actually had a riot. And so I call it this quiet migration south. So many Nova Scotians came, black and white actually, to New England. And my family in particular is settled in Lynn, Massachusetts. And so, so this is my story that has been being revealed to me as I do research and as my ancestors whisper in my ear, because many times I'm looking for things and I'm amazed that where I'm led. For instance, I just knew that there was a picture of my great-great-great-grandfather, and I had read his obituary and found that he was a member of the Veterans Post. And I called them up and I said, "Is there a picture of him in there?" And they said, "There is, yes, there is." So things like that happen, that there is a spiritual realm, and our ancestors want to be found, and they want to know they want us to know their story. And it's our responsibility. And as I've heard, it will be forgotten. In one generation, it will just be gone. And so that's what I'm finding, even talking to other family members. And my grandfather, Charles Fowler, he picked me. He picked me as the person. Because later on I found out he didn't tell everybody all those stories, or he took me visiting. So when I started doing my research, I said, "Oh, that's who that person was," because I just knew the people based upon how much cookies and milk I would get. And so I brought my quilts here because at the beginning of this journey, and I was just speaking to someone here, that this quilt here with the face was given to me, was created 22 years ago. And so that's when I really started my journey. My grandmother had a photo album that the pictures were faded, and I wanted some creative way of preserving the pictures as well as the stories behind the pictures. And fortunately for me, my grandparents had known each other since they were children, because they both lived in that Canadian enclave in Cambridge, Mass. They all lived in this little neighborhood. And so the pictures on here, and I hope that you can come up a little later and take a closer look. And in particular, this one here is my great-great-grandfather, who owned a farm in Farnstead, New Hampshire. And so I'm not quite sure. I think they must have summered here. You don't really think about that, but it's probably, and it was, a lot of times when people see the quilt, they say, "Oh, they were slaves." And I always have to correct them. I say, they were free people, and it's the 1920s, so it's long after slavery. But I'm pretty sure that they owned that farm like the 20s, the 30s, and to the 50s. And the oral history is that it was taken by eminent domain. And so that's more research for me. But if anybody knows anything about that history, please see me after. And I also want to point out that there's a picture of 5 generations of my family, of the men, and the oldest is David Fowler. He's the one who knocked over the horse. So there's a picture of him. He lived to be 100 years old. And so my grandfather was probably 28 when he passed away, so he really did know him. It wasn't just this fantasy that he had, or these stories that he made up. And he was about 6'4", so you can only imagine. And so in this picture is my great-great-great-grandfather, David Fowler, and then my great-great-grandfather, Israel Fowler, and then my great-grandfather, Edgar Fowler, and then his son, Edgar Fowler Jr., and then Edgar Fowler Jr.'s son, who's 1 year old. So you have 98-year-old and a 1-year-old in this picture. So I'm really fortunate to be able to talk about that. And I'll just say that there's a woman's face in the center. And so initially, I did this to honor my mom. And in honoring my mother, I honor her mother before her, and so on and so forth, because mothers are the reason we're here. And then there's little babies around her, the future of the world. And it's actually, believe it or not, I got her to put a plastic cast on her face. And so it's actually her face. And I'll just talk a little bit about the second quilt. It's Ya Asantewa, and if you recall, I mentioned her in my poem. And I mentioned her because when I first went to Ghana, we went to the military fort where Ya Asantewa where she was held. And this was called the last great war of 1900. It's when colonialism was really taking place in Ghana. And the British came and they said, look, we want your stuff. We want your golden stool. And this was an object that was very sacred to the people, and they refused. And they put the king in the slave fort. This is 1900 now, where he was held there, then he was brought to Benin and was in the slave fort there, and they were later exiled to the Seychelles Islands, where Ya Asante died like 20 years later, never to see her homeland again. But the elders and this is the Ashanti people, by the way, and in Kumasi, which is in the inland of Ghana. And so she said, look, we're not giving in to the British, and we're gonna fight to our death. And so that's how she ended up being captured, because she held them off successfully, and then they threatened her family. They threatened her children. And so she gave in, and that was her fate. But they never did get the golden stool. So that meant that feeling of keeping your memories and yourself and your people safe, the Ashanti people still have that. They know where they came from, and so I don't know, it could be the fact that when we went, the tour guide locked me in the cell that she was in, which was really like I went back in time or something happened. It was really, I'm not claustrophobic, but I became very claustrophobic, and it was just laid on my heart that I just should continue telling her story. And it is our story, because many of the people who were enslaved were from Ghana, which was the Gold Coast at that time. And so we're so disconnected, really, from that history, because those people came here, some of them are buried in the cemetery here. Those are the same people that, who knows, maybe that's why Ya Asantewa fought back, because some of her family was taken. That's not in the history book. I haven't read that anywhere. But the Ashanti also profited from the slave trade. You know, it wasn't clean. It was all this gray area. You know, it was the world economy. Everybody's hands was dirty. But she decided to fight back and paid with her life. So eventually, the people of the Ashanti region were able to get their king back. And while he was away, he learned English. Well, he learned to read and write, and he became the person who could be in two worlds, and they continue that way. I think that is all that I will say about my quilts, and I thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if does anybody have any questions or comments?
So was Ashanti, who was she? Was she a ruler of the Ashanti?
She was a queen mother of her village, which meant that she took care of her immediate village. And the system was matriarchal, so women had a lot of say. And they had an elder, they had an elders group who would come together and just make major decisions. And so when they did what she didn't think was appropriate, that's when she stepped in and she galvanized the women. She rode horseback, she carried a Danish musket, and she was not young. She was like, people say she was in her 80s, but I think she was probably 70, and she was doing all this. So she was tough. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yet even films today are strategically, I think, made to carry out a particular narrative and to reinforce a narrative such as who's most dangerous. Because that's what Birth of a Nation was all about, is creating this narrative that you had these people, mainly black men, coming out and we're going to do these horrible things to white women. And we are still living with that legacy today. And I think that even when you look at some of the popular films out now, because I'm a filmaholic, you can kind of see the narrative in some of the films, even though it's better, but you still see some of the same kind of Birth of the Nation kind of topics. So one of the things that we thought about, we had like 10 questions for you, because we were just overzealous. But one thing we were just saying, we wanted to ask questions of, you've heard both of us speak now, and we want you to compare and contrast. What were some of the same themes you heard, and what were some things that didn't overlap, or just any reflections on both of the talks as you think about what occurred today? That's a hard question. It's like a final exam. Final exam. I had some of those final exam texts. So, do you want to get in a small group and have a? No? Okay, all right. They work with my students. They're like, oh God, that small group. You want us to talk to each other? Gee. So, okay, so I won't make you talk to each other. Okay, there's a comment in the back. You want to go right?
Tell me. Narrative, the power of narrative. And obviously humans are complex beings in that we have a set of narratives that are woven into how we view ourselves. And all cultures probably talked about the power of word, whether it's spoken word or written word, but coming to a place where, I don't even know how to describe what I'm trying to say, but words are, both of you seem to have, without actually saying their weapons, have touched on the power of words as weapons, and as to how they've been used against Black people and people of color, and how in a way our society has been built so that when those are upended, they become weapons, in a sense, against not against white people, but against us moving forward, against us changing that cultural, that societal narrative. I don't have any answers for that, but dear God, that's a lot to unpack.
When we're talking about how did you get here, how did all of us get here, it seems as though if you're black, you're left out. You know, oh, you might have come from Ireland, your ancestors might have come from Ireland or Spain, but when the talk, it's like, how did the black people get here? It's never part of the dialogue.
I was struck by the remembering needed, that kind of work needed for African Americans to do to reclaim an identity and an ancestry. And the remembering that you spoke of for white people to kind of get rid of an identity or challenge the identity they've come to live with. And the contrast between those two and where they intersect and don't, I found really challenging and an interesting area to think a lot more about. And I did have one question, or is this not time for questions? Or a question? I was wondering...
You remember black people are nimble, you know? So I'm good with it, you know.
I was wondering if either of you have any ideas why the Holocaust can be not embraced, but at least not ignored in German history by Germans, while we can't seem to get a clear idea on slavery in our own country's narrative. And was this a conscious move of the post-World War II German government? Because certainly it is so much closer to home, you'd think denial would almost be stronger.
Well, that's a final exam question if I ever
That's a
heard
heck of
one.
a question. Maybe let me say this about post-war Germany. Wow, that cough drop's not helping at all. Germany had an interesting experience. Germany could not avoid the topic. It happened, of course, in a very different era with different sensibilities, but more importantly, the United States occupied Germany for years. And we made sure they confronted that history, starting with war crimes trials. And the Germans then ran with that. And because they needed a psychological defense of some kind, they went the other direction and embraced an identity as rejecting the Holocaust and everything it stood for, and being a different kind of Germany. And that wasn't entirely successful, but they embraced that identity. And that meant remembering and commemorating.
They also didn't let it fester for 150 years before they confronted
Well, that's the thing, right? After the Civil War, Reconstruction. And once the North reconceptualized the Civil War as a moral struggle to end slavery, which it was not. But once the North did that, the way we justify any war, we had to, in the North, make slavery about the South. So we had nothing to atone for. The South embraced the lost cause if you were white. And the message is gone. And by now, we have 150 years of layered myth and defense mechanism.
And people ask the same thing about how can we talk about the Holocaust without talking about the genocide of indigenous peoples. Because we'll have, long conversations, but we won't have that conversation. And again, it doesn't fit the narrative, because if we have to have that conversation, it kind of counter those other narratives that we have. And once again, don't get me started on capitalism. Because I might not stop.
Well, in regard to your question, a couple of observations. I come from, I work with trauma survivors, and much of your presentation, Dr. Morris, seemed to have to do with trauma work. And so one of the thoughts I have is that we're looking at both sides of the coin. We're looking at perpetrators and we're looking at victims. And so the work needs to be done on both parts. And that the work is not cognitive, but it's really addressing feelings and digging deep inside and taking responsibility for one's experience and working through those feelings, working through all the issues that have to do with, in this case, slavery and racism. And that obviously is a difficult process.
You know, I mention this person's name quite often, so I'm kind of like his groupie. He's kind of like the Mick Jagger, anyway. But he's a colleague of mine at K State. His name is James Waller, and he's an endowed chair in our Holocaust and Genocides department. But he's written a couple books that I think are just amazing books around looking at the behavior of perpetrators of atrocities. He's interviewed, I think he said 160 so far. And how can we use that information, again, to help us move forward, including looking at the effects on even children, because, you know, I don't know if you ever read the book Hitler's Willing Executioners. It was out like in 1990 something or another. And what it was that a lot of people knew it was happening, but they were in denial. So their, you know, I'm gonna just say husband would go off to work, you know, he would do whatever he did, he would come home. And the way that trauma and abuse works is that people have to be in, you collude. So you basically say, I'm not gonna say anything, even though I know something's going on here, if you don't say it outright. And so what happens is, meanwhile, people are getting hurt. So even bystanders, to a great degree, would need to be worked with in this, if we look at trauma. People who observe these types of things occurring, or that they are new immigrants to the country and they're observing the dynamics that's taking place in the country as a result of this system of slavery.
Aren't we all colluding with what's going on at the borders right now?
I think we are.
Yes,
I think we
Mexican
are.
border,
I think
as we just listen
yeah,
to the news.
I'm right there with you.
Can I see if there's anybody else who hasn't asked a question, hasn't spoken yet?
Right here.
And there's a hand back there.
I'm gonna poke him and then the.
You can hear steps in here.
Yeah, it's my turn. And I took my heels off.
Don't you look different?
Yeah, I thank you both for being here. It was very interesting to hear from one side and then the other side. And to me, it ended up like, I think I've tried to balance my life between the two. And the reason why I say that is that my birth certificate is of color, okay? In the 60s, it came out, again, about black. I couldn't quite associate myself as being black, but a person of color, et cetera, and that. So, you know, I went through the paperwork of my history and came up very proud on the black color side, going back to slavery, et cetera, this and that. I haven't done too much on the white side, but what I've done with my DNA, I've been able to prove paperwork to my black side, and I've learned about my white side, et cetera, especially on my mother's side, et cetera, this and that. So when you say it takes time and discussion to talk, when you're living it, a lot of people said things to me that they didn't know what I was, et cetera, this and that. And it's kind of like, do I say something? Do I not say something? Will they shut up and just go away? My wife is more vocal than I am.
That's a rumor. I heard that rumor too. You told me.
Yeah, so I think I've been blessed being able to have a blend, et cetera, and kind of understand both sides, this and that. And it's kind of thing I'm learning now more to talk about it, but it's still kind of a, what do you say in the moment? And I wish we had more things like this to have an open discussion, but it's very hard in New Hampshire to have that kind of discussion, etc. So, you know, there's people who I've talked to who I would consider wanting to be a friend, but I would still keep kind of a distance because of how they think. And then there's other things. So I really appreciate, okay, you know, the conversation. You know, with my DNA, I'm like a third African American. And I also belong to a tribal group in New Jersey. But I really don't know much about the Indian tribal side. Okay, because I'm not there, except this and that type of thing. So thank you for your presentation.
Going back to your talk, and you're talking about roots and transferring things. I went to the Indian Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, and they talked about removing the children from the tribe and teaching them to a school. They got punished if they talked their own language. And I looked back and I said, that's exactly what they've done to the blacks. Except not only did they move their language, they pull them out of their country. I felt sorry for the Indians for some reason or the other because they were denied their language. But I had no really sympathy for the blacks, which I'm having a hard time to understand. But it was even worse. Why do I have more sympathy for the Native American than I have for the non-Native American that was transported here, not of their own request, unless you talk to the chairman of the New Hampshire Housing, who says, the federal housing, who said we came here on our own to better ourselves.
Yeah. Wow. That just goes to show you how complex all this is, that we can't, you know, some things there's just not an answer for. And yeah, that's a hard one.
I had a question, if I may. And in a more contemporary way, as the discussion around slavery has become more eminent, if you will, there's a great deal of discussion about reparations and how reparations is part of dealing with this trauma or the post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And so I'm wondering, what role do you see this reparative justice playing into the discussion as it relates to what everyone needs to be thinking about and more importantly, acting on as we move into this era that we are now in, as it relates to the political situation in the country, as well as in the world, because we know that reparations is moving ahead. The discussion, at least, is being moving ahead throughout the diaspora. And the U.S. is quite a bit behind on that one, although we seem to be ahead on everything else.
I think that for me, the truth-telling piece, I think that we've both put out there, I think that that is such a key piece. Because it's not just around economics. It's just about something, and again, Dr. Waller talks about this in his work. There's something about owning up to something being the truth. You know, going back to that gaslighting that I talked about, there's something about people acknowledging that is very important. So the truth telling, to say these things really did happen and we are going to document it. I think that for a lot of processes that I've looked at around truth and reconciliation, so if you look at South Africa, if you look at Rwanda, if you look at so many other places, that is always the first part, where people are truth telling. And then the truth telling is paired with an authentic apology. And with the apology comes an action or a behavior to show that the apology is sincere. And that the action is not just one to be done. You know, I mean, if you're planning to give somebody or repair something, you don't like go here. But it's all, everything is very nuanced in the way it's done. So those are my 3 kind of steps that I think would need to happen. Whenever I hear reparations, I always say that it would be stronger if we teamed up with the indigenous people and say, we want reparations, not only for us, but the indigenous people. When we think about some people, especially in the southern United States or in parts of California, where the land was illegally acquired. So some of the indigenous folks that are now below that line and above that line who are relatives, we want reparations for them and the land taken. So I think that we could have a stronger force. And so what would that look like, you might say? Well, let's think about health care. Let's think about the way that we approach housing for people. Let's think about the way education, for goodness sake, that when you look at the inequality that exists around education, I mean, that is a crime. Andrew Young was like, that's just not okay. So when I think of retribution, retribution? That could be reparation. When I think about reparation, I think about all of those kinds of things, about let's improve these systems that could continue to oppress. So it would be, in my mind, it would be paramount to what Winona LaDukes would say, is that I don't want just a bigger piece of the pie, I want a different pie altogether. And so how would we co-create a different pie to make sure, again, the action part of the is really there. And the other thing is, how do we do it? How do we dismantle the system? Because then again, can the master's tool dismantle the master's house? So what tools would be used to dismantle those systems to make sure that those systems are not in place? And to me, that would be reparation. That's, in my mind, when I think about reparation, it would have to include those things. And I don't know if we're ready. I just said, I'll leave it.
You want to say something?
Yeah.
Well, I would just add that I thought that was very well said. Dan, you know, if we had $1 trillion in reparations, trillion with a T, that might solve some problems if we're managed well, but it would not eliminate psychological dynamics, biases. It would not dismantle institutional or systemic forms of oppression. And if it somehow did, it would be because it started with education,
right,
with learning, with coming together. And that's where, and I know people can differ about the value of an apology or whatever, but that acknowledgement piece, right? Because I've seen firsthand that acknowledgement can make a difference, and it's part of that process of moving forward towards shared understanding. We need that.
So I'm wondering if both of you might talk a little bit about praxis in this work, because I appreciate what you both said about it not just being cognitive, but I do think some of us white folks like to stay in an emotional place sometimes, preferable to the full cycle of praxis, which is education, action, reflection, in an endless loop. And so I think about the question about the moment of absolution in the film, and I'm always cautious about absolution. I'm just like, why do I think that should come in my lifetime when so many people before me labored with a belief we would end up somewhere different that they would never see? And isn't it a blessing to just be part of that, trying to work towards something you might not live for, but your life can be in dedication to it. And I just think it requires constant praxis. And I just wonder if you could speak about, you know, what praxis looks like, you know, what a model of praxis might look like from your different perspectives in this, because I think we need all of it. And I hear you saying that, but I think to like say it really concretely, for some of us like to stay in an education place or a feeling place or a just doing place, and we really need all those components to push this forward. Right?
Praxis or practice?
Praxis with an X.
She wants you to define.
Yeah.
Oh, so it's like an endless cycle of, say, theory or education, action and reflection, and it doesn't mean they all come in that same order, but it's a set, and it is a practice. But the idea is you can't really achieve what you're looking for with just one piece of that. You need all of it constantly. So we can't stay in one part of that. And some of us are inclined to, I think white people, I'm just going to speak for my people.
Well, these are final exam questions. I didn't study. So you
I'll offer an answer. It won't be profound, but it will be an answer. I spent 2 days this week being interviewed by the Voice of America for a special they're doing on race this summer. And obviously this was before my voice went, or it would have been a 5-minute interview. And at one point, the interviewer asked me, he said, "Why is it you are still, after 20 years, involved in this work?" And I kind of laughed. And my first reaction was to think, because it's not finished and there's a lot more to be done. And the answer I gave him was that as a white person, I have the privilege, as one of my many white privileges, of walking away from issues of race anytime I want to. And one of the few things I can do to reject white privilege in my life is to say, I will not walk away from this work. I did this full time until the day my first child was born. And that day I became a stay-at-home dad, but I continued in this work as best I could. And so I am far too stubborn to walk away from the work, for precisely that reason. But the answer I could have given was just as well. You alluded to this, the fact that we need to keep putting one foot in front of the other. We need to have no hope of exactly how far we'll get in our lifetimes. We might think carefully about exactly what steps we can take that will have the most long-term impact, because we know we're talking long-term, not short-term. But one foot in front of the other at all times is about the best praxis we can imagine, I think. I told you it wouldn't be profound, but it matters to me.
Well, I think that's the answer. So I don't know how much I can add, except I think that, this will show a bias of mine. I don't ever think we're done. We're always becoming. And I think that the worldview that some people come from is that you start here and you stop there and you're done. And so that linear way of thinking, the worldview that I think a lot of people, not all, of who are white, they have that linear thinking. You start here, you're done, and then it's just linear. Whereas, I don't think that way. I think of, you do something, you evaluate it, you alter, you take in feedback, and you start over, because I'm never done. You're just never done. You'll be becoming your entire life. So I think that if we could shift that worldview into saying that you're done, then I think that could potentially be helpful. How do we do that? If I could give you that answer, I would just be on Oprah right now. Writing me some books. So no, I don't know the answer.
The spiritual component matters the most to me. As a member of the Baha'i faith, the central Baha'i teaching is the oneness of the human family. God says we're all one human family. And in 1912, Abdu'l-Baha, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, came to America and spoke to the NAACP convention and talked about the most challenging issue for America. Now, the Baha'i world is a worldwide religion, but the most challenging issue for America is the black-white issue, and we need to deal with it. So I commend all of you, all of us. We're preaching to the choir, we know that, but I commend all of you for your ongoing work in this field.
I again thank both of you. It's just so, I got to go home and write 6 different threads of the book I'm working on. I have a question. In my experience, both personal and institutional and whatever, in my work. The dominant attitude of anti-racist work and Holocaust studies and German studies and women's studies and raising an African-American child with many challenges, most of them with regard to identity in New Hampshire and so on, is that there's a great sense of patronage and in trying to advocate and break open the boxes and so on. I am so often faced with the pushback in any context, from liberal Germans who my peers are the daughters of men who died in the resistance, and they resent the fact that I'm doing a multidisciplinary thing rather than just focusing on, the good Germans, so on. But I would like to ask particularly, and this hooks back to this morning, Dr. Morris, about addressing how to teach our children. And, I'm a parent of an African American. I don't have any white children. I have white relatives who will have nothing to do with my child or me. I'm a different person when I'm with her. At the open house on Saturday, I was just my complete person because she was with me, And yet, she, at this developmental stage of almost 30, more like 15 cognitively and 13 emotionally, but 30 in her rage and strength, inner strength, she said, coming out of there, I'm home. I knew everybody here. And I think it was partly because we were together and she wasn't ashamed of me there, like she is other places. So I have been her advocate and her enemy for 30 years. And in trying to narrate, give her a different narrative than she hears, I am breaking all the relationships she has valued, like, her favorite teacher in front of me said, like she wanted me to bring all these wonderful children's books I had read with her to school because she would, be able to present her favorite books that are all about African Americans and so on. And her teacher, whom she adored and, would kind of good cop, bad cop with her and me, her teacher said in front of her, Nancy, why are you so hung up on race stuff? We don't have blacks in New Hampshire. I have been haunted by that ever since, and she still loves that teacher and tells me, I'm really hung up, I talk too much, I'm always fighting stuff. And so I think the basic issue is that I'm rooted in this desire to be an advocate and, not fix her issues, but being in this multi-layered identity search that she would have. It's always going to be there. And, she lives in Massachusetts now, and that's easier, but, and I'll never be black. I'll never really know her trauma, but she's adopted. That's part of it, too. I'd love some thoughts about parenting and educating black children who are mostly in the white world. And, she has the advantage of being female. She's not getting shot at.
Well, black women get shot at. Black women are murdered all the time by the police.
I was just talking about what you're talking about just yesterday because I had to work with the faculty over how do you have difficult conversations in class, and mainly about race and all those things. And one of the things that I said, is that living in New England and particularly working in New Hampshire, I've had some heartbreaking moments as it related to kids representing racial minority groups where they come in with no sense of self or their own identity. It's really heartbreaking to see this because they didn't have any reflections of themselves, sometimes not even in their homes, and definitely not at their schools. So then I get to see them at 18, 19, 20, 21 years old where they're searching for that sense of self. As far as younger kids, because I haven't worked with a lot of younger kids in New Hampshire, but I did in the state of Washington, in a place that was pretty rural. What we found to be Washington State, not Washington D.C., but what we found to be effective there was to make sure that kids did have reflections of themselves around in a variety of places, especially if they were adopted, to make ourselves available. So we had a whole group of people and we made ourselves available to families, to young people in those situations. We also tried to work with the parents, and you know, that could be easy or complicated because some parents are very resistant to that type of work. And I mean, if the kid was adopted, very resistant. But again, we had to give it a try. So it is really complicated, but I would say the first thing is to make sure that the child has contact with people who are a reflection of themselves. And most of all, if you have adopted a kid of color, is that you have friends who reflect how they look. Because what ends up happening is that I'm not laughing because it's funny, I'm laughing because it is really heartbreaking when there's a student there and it's a student of color and they haven't been around other people of color and they almost run from people like me. You know, and so I try to say hello to them and they hurry up and get away. And I know what that's about. I know what that's about, and that's what breaks my heart. I know what that's about for them. So I always say we have to just be persistent and consistent with our interactions. And so eventually those are the young people who ended up, talking to, because I just keep saying, hello, how are you? Did you know this was happening? And I think that more of us have to make ourselves available as much as we can to have those conversations. But it is complicated.
Mine's a quick question for James. I had the pleasure of seeing the documentary several years ago and would love to show it to students, but I can't find it anywhere. So I'm wondering if you happen to know where I could get my hands on it.
This is at thetrade.org.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it on Netflix?
Is it on Netflix?
Is it on Netflix? Oh.
It's not particularly expensive, but look for it in your local library or college library.
Yeah, I was about to say, look at your local, because that's, it's not in the local library.
I have to go, but I just wanted to share the most important emotional response that I had to this, and that was that you and the following speaker spoke so proudly of your ancestors centuries ago, and that sense that you were connected. And I wonder how many people in this room have anything like that. I certainly don't. So I loved hearing that.
Crystal, do you want to show your genealogy chart? Just to give you a sense?
Okay, the question I want to ask is from two educators, how do we get textbooks to change and where does that begin?
You've got to go to Texas. Be an activist. Texas. You've got to protest in Texas. You've got to point out the absurdity and talk about slaves on picnics and singing songs in your one page on slavery in your textbook. Because that's a deliberate choice and they move away from it and they return to it. That's a very conscious act of mythologizing.
I say write a book.
Even better.
I just want to say thank you for asking me, because I forgot this was like the end of my And these are all the descendants of Reuben Fowler, the Black.
Where are you? Where are you on the chart?
I have my glasses on.
The microphone.
Oh, can you talk to me? Actually, I haven't looked at it in a while, but I'm in the bottom here somewhere. In this last, well, the second to the last generation. And these are all the children of Reuben Fowler, the Black loyalist, the one that I'm honoring here, the one that was David Fowler's father. And this is the results of someone who survived. So this is the success of, you know, I can't say that, you know, I have famous relatives or that, you know, they were the first to go to college or any of these kinds of things, but I can say that I'm here because each generation survived. And so that's what this is.
Yes. You have your head down.
Thank you. So everything happens for a reason, right? Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. I don't know if we have any closing words, but there we are. A lot of things for you to take home and to think about. And I think when we do this work, there's always an action part, but we all come to that action part at our own place, in our own time, and in our own way. Even if that action is in ourselves, trying to understand where we are on this journey. So that's where I'll leave you all to think about all the things we talked about today. Some of us takes action in our own self, and some of us are active in our communities, and some of us are active in our world. So wherever you fit in on that spectrum, I ask you to at least do something. Because the more of us who are doing something, the more we can change, or more we can move towards change. As they say, the work never ends, may never end, but if we create a space in our little world that's better, and everybody does that, then we've got a bigger world that's better. Thank you all.